how liberating or how restrictive was it using 6 different actors playing the same character?
From a conceptual standpoint, and in the creation of the script, that was a tremendous liberty and freedom for a filmmaker. If anything, it was a process of how to pull it all together and create some cohesion in a film that I knew was still never going to deliver the kind of palpable, reductive, results of that the traditional biopic usually delivers. And yet it is a biopic. It does quote at the early life of somebody, the famous moments in somebody's life that we come to the theater with some knowledge of, the hit songs at the hit moments, and it does give you those sort of, those kernels of, those handles. But if anything, and Oren Hoberman, who co-wrote the script with me, was great. I had worked on it for a couple years alone, and it was a massive first research and then execution process. And I needed, Oren had been, we would discuss this earlier offshoot of this project, so he was a little familiar with what I was doing. And it was very helpful to have somebody come in and help me reduce and form a cohesive film out of it all. But yeah, the theory of freedom, I guess ultimately what is very tied into this idea of identity that the film posits, and that Dylan's life, I think, is a living sort of argument for, which is that, people tell you to find yourself and be yourself, and that is a sort of freedom. But I think his life and his work and the pressures that he lived under kept forcing that into question, and that the ultimate freedom is really in being able to escape that, and it being able to continually reinvent yourself.
Let's talk about the casting just a bit, because I imagine that you were working on the script for about 5 years, and I was wondering at what point did you begin thinking of particular artists who you wanted to cast in the film? Most obvious, of course, did you see The Aviator and decide that Kate Blanchett was the person who could play? Yes.
I didn't really have any actors in mind while writing, with the possible exception of Charlotte Gainsbourg, who I'd seen in films and really, really loved, and something about her qualities as an actress and her Frenchness did inform the decision to make that character French, and that she just felt so right as the love object in this Dylan film. And I knew from the beginning that the Jew character that Kate plays would be played by a woman. That was part of the original concept for that section of the film. Exactly who was not something I knew at the time, but it didn't take long to, sort of clear the path a little bit and recognize Kate's amazing, the physical transformations that go on in every one of her roles, when they're even far less flamboyantly demanding than this one, and those that call less attention to the physical transformations. They're always there. She's a very physical actor, I think. She really does have to find the equivalent body parts and gestures to understand a character, and then throws herself into it at that level with a lot of intellectual and other help as well.
She's not here to talk for herself, but what kind of preparation did she do? Was she studying Don't Look Back and other footage of the period?
Yeah, our kind of major text, more than Don't Look Back, was the film Eat the Document. Because although some people will look at the film and think of Don't Look Back immediately, I insist that the Dylan of 1 year later, in 1966, was a completely distinct Dylan. And that's the one that you see in this unreleased experimental documentary, Eat the Document, that Penny Baker also shot in color for the Dylan tour, the 1966 tour in the UK. And a lot of the footage, the beautiful footage of Dylan that you see in Scorsese's documentary, the color stuff, and singing, which sort of forms the sort of, is the present tense bookends of that film, is all from the 1966 show, from footage shot for Eat the Document. But you see this strangely dandified, hyper-anxious creature, really, that it exceeds that slightly petulant, at times brat in Don't Look Back, challenging journalist. A year later, I think it was partly just being fueled by having a backup band behind him. There's something very lonely about Dylan going out in the dark every night, even if he's in Don't Look Back, even if he's in the backstage hotel room with all his buddies, and he's still, ruling the roost. He goes out alone with his acoustic guitar to these reverent, silent halls, and plays these long songs that he started to lose excitement in performing. And the energy and the kind of antagonism and really the sort of punk climate that he found himself in, and that he utilized like the true punk artists would do later, that animosity that I think ended up fueling his work all the further, is so evident in that following year. And so that became something Kate looked at a lot. But what's so great about, obviously, this whole period for all these actors and for Dylan is there's so much material for them to give them. I made little CD mixes for every one of them for their characters. I gave them these portfolio books just full of images of all the Dylans and all the sort of visual and cinematic references that each of their stories would employ, and found recordings of him being interviewed in the specific periods in which their characters emerge from, and films as well, concert films or documentaries or whatever, and films that inspired him, films that he was turned on by for different periods as well. So all that material, and actors love having that stuff. It's really helpful. And then at a certain point, I noticed this with all of them in the final stages, in the costume, in the makeup trucks, the final fine-tunings of hair and wig and costume and stuff, and they would just be like, okay, I just got to do it. It almost made them too nervous and too just freaked out to be thinking about it anymore. They just had to start doing it.
They didn't run into each other much on the set?
Unfortunately, not too much, because they would have enjoyed each other's company. It was kind of a moving train that never stopped, and when Richard Gere would get back on, Woody would pop off, and we were on a kind of endless. I think there are a couple little crossovers, but not too many.
Sure. Question, observation that there's a lot of Fellini in the Jude sequence, and could you talk about the cinematic references?
You got a little Fellini,
yeah.
Fellini right there. Because of the potential for this just to unspool, chaotically in every direction, I felt that the stylistic references, and in many cases the literal historical references in the film, could and should all be rooted in the 60s. I kind of felt like all of the major strands of these Dylan faces, these archetypes, if you will, whatever you want to call them, have their root in the 60s. Even the Western, even the old-time Western Dylan really came out in this. He finally ducked out and went into hiding in 1967 in Woodstock and produced, first the Basement Tapes recordings, and then John Wesley Harding, and then a year later, Nashville Skyline, and was living the country life by the end of the 60s when his following were exploding in psychedelia and Woodstock, literally a hill over, from where he lived. So these cinematic references I felt would be, and again, I had the richest palette of references to draw from within the 60s era, which slips into the early 70s in my mind as well. So for Jude's story, Kate's story, I did, I toyed for a minute of referring to Don't Look Back stylistically, like as a sort of a cinema verite style film, but I quickly realized I wanted to find the cinematic equivalent for what the music was like, what his sort of creative imagination was doing at each time. And in that case, a verite film was hardly a good way, in my mind, to depict the Baroque and complex imagination of a record like Blonde on Blonde, which is the sort of penultimate work of that time. And it didn't take long to revisit 8½, and see a story of an artist besieged by the critics and questioned hysterically for meaning and truth, and why aren't you doing what you did before, and have that be distorted by the beauty of that camera and that black and white cinematography and those sets and those locations. It just seemed the ideal and humorous way to bring that out of that story. And then for the, I won't go through every one of them because it'll take, but I'll pick some key ones. The Robbie story, the relationship of Heath Ledger to Charlotte Gainsbourg. I looked at the early Godard films and found in them, obviously, that a very specific kind of cleanness, visual cleanness in the way they're shot and framed, that I also found really resonant to the era. But I also found in them a contradictory relationship toward women that I thought was really symptomatic of Dylan's in some ways, in that they treat the female characters often in the early Godard films, and there's some I'm thinking of in particular, like Masculine and Feminine, with a kind of poetic susceptibility and beauty, but a kind of, they're kind of exempt from the political discourse that's also defining those films, and the kind of the man talk, you know, the stuff guys can talk about. And the women are more involved in existential or personal kind of questions that aren't always given the same weight. And there's been, you know, ways in which Dylan's music, and particularly music from that particular time, has been questioned for the way it talks about women as a regard toward women, and I wanted to have a kind of tension between the two characters, and definitely but then there, you know, then there are movies like Two or Three Things I Know About Her, which was also color, so I loved looking at that movie, where the female voice and dialogue, I'm literally quoting lines directly from that film toward the end when Charlotte is speaking directly to camera and telling her that she has to leave. So I used the films both to critique the way some depictions of women were executed in the 60s, but also to kind of let the female have the final word. And then ultimately the Billy story, the Richard Gere story, which was an embrace of Western genre, and which meant a lot to Dylan, and the traditions of roots music and American folklore that is this whole other through line in his work, and his imaginations, and literally his involvement in the Penny Baker, the Peckinpah film, Pat Garrett, Billy the Kid. I looked at that film, of course, but I was even more struck by just a different kind of camera that came out of the late, what I call sort of the hippie westerns of the late 60s, where the Western genre was sort of reinvented by the counterculture and given a kind of new outlaw, a kind of anti-hero authenticity, all its own, and were often accompanied by almost obligatorily, if that's a word, contemporary music, like the Leonard Cohen score in McCabe and Mrs. Miller, or the Burt Bacharach score in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, or the Dylan score in Pat Garrett.